You are watching Bygone Treasures, your source for everything history and geopolitics, now in session. You have most definitely seen or heard of these films. It demonstrates how a pirate's existence is one in which one sails the oceans pillaging for booty. But what was the real story of pirates, especially in the Caribbean? What made them and what did they do on a day-to-day basis? This is the real story of the pirates of the Caribbean. During the 1500s to 1830, piracy in the Caribbean was a particular issue, but it wasn't until the 1650s until the 1720s that piracy was a major issue, sometimes called the Golden Age of Piracy. During this time, there were whole port cities made for pirates in the Caribbean, like Port Royal, Tortuga and Nassau, the last one now the capital of the Bahamas. And in general, whenever a lucrative trade begins between two continents over water, pirates will emerge. We saw them in the Mediterranean, Indian Oceans, and nowadays in the Horn of Africa. This particular booming trade was found inside the Caribbean at this time, which started to be colonized for growing products that couldn't survive in Europe. The magical product was sugar, which the Europeans went crazy for after being introduced to it. Tobacco was also farmed, and gold and silver from the New World passed by the Caribbean too. The other way, the Europeans would bring slaves to work in their colonies. All of these boats were passing by ripe for the plunder, and pirates took advantage of it. But was there anything else that made the pirates spring up in this sea? What did the Caribbean look like at this time? Politics of a pirate. In the early 1600s, Spain and Portugal both had powerful political influence in the Caribbean. Spain had the most colonies in the area, and by that time, they controlled many of the region's major cities such as Havana, Cartagena, San Juan and Santo Domingo. However, in the same decade, England's economy began to grow quickly, and the English realised that since they lived on an island, no one could attack them if they had a strong navy. They invested heavily in the seas. At the same time, France was also doing well, and both started their own Caribbean and American colonies. 80 years later or so, after a pretty major war, the Dutch became the European centre of business, inventing some maritime beauties like the floit, which allowed them to trade with ease. However, the Dutch were too obsessed with spices to focus on the sugar market, investing more in the East Indies rather than the West Indies. It's also important to note that in the early Caribbean, the Spanish had the only real self-sustaining colonies, whereas everyone else just needed materials to ship in quite regularly. The Spanish domination of the seas meant that the pirates were not too common yet, as they would be trampled by Spanish ships. Spain had a treasure fleet that would sail fairly regularly to collect the New World loot. This would consist of hundreds of ships which no single pirate ship could ever even think of defeating, but it made a very different type of pirate, a privateer. A privateer was a pirate hired by a nation to plunder enemy ships. The English and French used these quite often against the Spanish in this period, and then tragedy struck. Europe, beefing about religious differences, decided to have a 30-year-long war called the 30 Years' War. Everyone was involved, and everyone needed their troops and fleets in Europe for this fighting. Of course, some fighting did bleed into the Caribbean, but it wasn't built up enough yet for major fighting to happen here. This war meant less resources were going to colonizing and defending the colonies. During this time, it wasn't necessarily pirates who were going around the Caribbean, but privateers raiding Spanish colonies, but after 30 years the war was over. Not for Spain and France, who fought a Franco-Spanish war right after. It was during this time when England took Jamaica from Spain for themselves. Now Spain went from having a monopoly over Caribbean trade to being one of the weaker powers there. The Golden Age of Piracy started when peace happened in Europe, meaning production boomed, sugar appetites were up, and trade had to flow. The war left a surplus of sailors who were now unemployed. Many turned to the life of the seas. The Golden Age of Piracy was split into roughly 3 phases, not specific to the Caribbean. The first phase was between 1650 and 1680, called the buccaneering phase. This is when English and French pirates would attack weak Spanish fleets. The second phase, called the Pirate Round, was in the 1690s to 1710s. Pirates would sail across the entire globe to rob Muslim trading empires in the Indian Ocean. The last phase was between 1715 and 1726, when after the War for Spanish Succession, a new wave of unemployed sailors became pirates. During this golden age, the English and Dutch had a huge trade war, and the French and Dutch had a normal war. This led to the English and French becoming the largest Caribbean powers by 1720, and honestly, it was mainly the British. They became powerful enough to successfully fight off pirates and realised that peaceful trade was way more profitable than hiring privateers to destroy your competition. So pirates slowly dwindled out in the Caribbean after the 1720s, becoming less and less important. The last pirate haven lasted until 1718, called the Republic of Pirates. In a rather fitting end to the Golden Age of Piracy, the Republic of Pirates did not go out in a massive war, but a small skirmish and a pardon for all pirates to turn themselves in. The sea's life. If you could spend all your time with your friends on the high seas and get some nice booty, would it be worth it to be a pirate? Well, most pirates were retired sailors who were unhappy with the rules and lack of pay, which led sailors who wanted to make money to become pirates. A famous pirate captain named Black Bart once said, "In an honest service there are thin commons, low wages and hard labour. In this plenty and satiety, pleasure and ease, liberty and power. A merry life and a short one shall be my motto." This pretty much tells you everything you need to know about a pirate's life. It's more free and relaxing than life in the Navy. It was usually better but also shorter. A pirate made more money and lived on a more democratic ship than any boat in the Navy. A crewmate made 1/5 of what the captain did, which is very fair compared to most businesses in history. A pirate could vote, but they usually had to swear on the Bible, swords, cannons or human skulls to do so. Pirate laws and rules include the right to vote, the right to carry a gun, and the right to a share of the loot. Other rules include not gambling and sometimes not smoking, no women on the ship, no abandoning the pirate ship, nighttime at 8 p.m. in the cabins, no stealing, keeping your weapons clean, and no fraud of any kind. Breaking these rules usually meant death, but some other punishments for breaking them included cutting your limbs off, shooting you in the leg, or leaving you on a deserted island while also shooting you in the leg. But also whatever punishment the captain and majority deemed fit, which is pretty democratic for a cruel ending. Pirate warfare was not a swashbuckling time either. It usually involved trying to capture the enemy and torture them as much and as brutally as possible before killing them. Food was scarce, usually just hardtack. Scurvy was rampant and these ships were disgusting, usually filled with flies and maggots. So if you're thinking the life of a pirate might be nice, you might want to think again. But for some people they got so much more glory or freedom even after all these horrible aspects that the pirate life was just right for them. For example, Blackbeard is probably the most famous pirate of all time, and even though he worked mainly off the American coast, he dipped his feet into Caribbean waters now and then. After the Golden Age of Piracy, he sailed back to Africa where he met his end fighting in a battle. Two other pirates, even though most ships had no women policies, were Anne Bonny and Mary Read. Both of these women pirates worked for Captain Calico Jack, and even though they were women, they killed them badly, as any good pirate would. Mary Red was caught and died in jail, but Anne Bonny disappeared and no one knows what happened to her. The last group of pirates are slave pirates. African slaves in the Caribbean had some of the worst lives. This has been bygone treasures. So, is the life of a pirate right for you? Don't forget to like, subscribe and leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts and keep the conversation going.